Hello and welcome to the IdeaCast interview series, episode number 119. I have two guests in this episode. I have Richard Watson and Matthew Segall, and I'll spare you a long intro if you want to find out more about them. If this is your first time coming to meet either one of these people, I will have plenty of information down below in the description field for both of them. This was their first time getting together and their first dialogue, and I was grateful to be able to host them. And this is a very productive conversation from where I was sitting, and I hope you enjoy it as well. And they should be coming back in about 2 months. We're looking at September. This is just past it's the third week of July. So hopefully September we can get them back. So enjoy the conversation. I appreciate you being here. And I'd like to re-welcome Richard Watson and Matt Segall to the IdeaCast interview series. They've both been guests of mine before, and I'm just so grateful to have them here together in a for a dialogue. And so welcome to both of you.
Thank you, Justin. Happy to be here.
Yeah, thanks for making it happen.
Yeah, well, I appreciate your willingness to get together on my channel, and I hope to be a salon host here. You know, I'm not going to be terribly involved in the conversation, save for maybe a question or two at the end. So that you all were here, came here, and are with me, that speaks a lot to my good fortune. So anyway, but what I'd like to do is just step out of the way, and I think Matt, I might hand it to you to open up and maybe ask something of Richard, and then just whoop, it'll go from there. So carry it on,
Sure.
carry away, Matt. Thank you.
Sure. Well, where do I want to begin? Well, Richard, I know that you do a lot of work on sort of evolutionary theory and evolution as a learning process or a cognitive process, and that while you have a lot of respect, if that's a way I can put it, for Darwin's theory of natural selection, it seems not to explain everything in the biological world that is there to be explained. And so you're trying to find other scientific explanations for the kinds of organization and behavior and, dare I say, consciousness and agency and these things that traditionally have been difficult to get a scientific grasp on, but are on evidence in the living world. And so I want to talk to you more about that. And from my point of view as a philosopher, it seems to me that evolution in the course of the 20th century became less just a theory of biological speciation and more a cosmological principle, something that's at play at every scale. And there may be some general account of evolution that applies across all these scales, from the atomic to the astrophysical and everything in between. But there is something unique going on about the living world. And so I guess when you think about evolution writ large, say cosmological evolution, how would you frame that in a sort of general enough account of evolution that it applies across all these scales? And what makes biological evolution unique in your view?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so you're right that I have some respect. That's probably the right word for what Darwin achieved in the theory that he proposed. But I'm, as my research progresses, I'm less and less convinced that it explains the things it's believed to explain. So, it definitely happens. It's true that populations contain variation, that some of that variation is heritable, and some of that heritable variation affects survival and reproduction. So natural selection occurs. But to get from that to the complexity and diversity of life is quite a leap. There's something you mentioned there about the sort of universality of selection. I think that it is, it's invoked in lots of domains which aren't biological. We can talk about the variation and selection processes on technology or on cultural practices or on cosmological constants. It gets invoked in lots of other domains. And there's another kind of universality, which is more a sort of exclusivity claim, really. So Dawkins claimed that natural selection is the only possible process that could produce adaptive organization spontaneously. That's something which which I think is plain wrong. But that's something which greatly limits our understanding of what kinds of natural phenomena can be adaptations and what kinds of natural phenomena can be adapted. You also asked about what's different about the living systems, though. I think that I'm kind of comfortable with there being something special about living systems, but by degree rather than categorically. I think I'm moving towards a view where certain kinds of physical systems can be cognitive spontaneously, but most physical systems aren't very cognitive. And the biological ones are special in so much as the depth of the cognition that they exhibit is high, deep, whereas a bag of rocks doesn't have much cognitive depth. So that's the sort of territory that I'm in. Is that starting in the right place?
Yes. I'll ask the simple question. Maybe it's not so simple, but when you use the word cognition, what do you mean? Is a cognitive system necessarily conscious or not? What's going on?
I'm referring to processes of memory, learning, and adaptive behavior. And I don't know what to do with consciousness. I don't. I feel that's a failing, but I feel like I'm not alone.
Oh yeah, no, you're in good company there. So I definitely agree with you that life, biological forms of organization are a matter of a difference of degree rather than of kind, which is I think a somewhat unusual position to take. I guess I just finished reading and reviewing a paper by Johannes Jaeger and John Vervaeke and others about relevance realization, and they strongly argue that there's a categorical difference between biological organisms and the physical and anything going on in the physical and the chemical world in terms of dissipative structures or forms of self-organization. And they're arguing strongly against the idea that there could ever be an algorithmic or computational realization of that kind of biological agency. And Vervaeke's technical term, relevance realization, it's not algorithmic, they say, and they give some pretty strong reasons for that. But it seems to me that in an effort to distinguish the living world from the rest of what the physical universe is up to, they may help us understand how consciousness can arise in multicellular organisms with nervous systems and all of that. But it leaves us with a new explanatory gap, which would be that between non-life and life, namely the issue of the origin of life. How could a self not just self-organizing, but self-producing system, an autopoietic system, if you will, ever get started. And the autopoietic theorists like to argue that actually self-production logically precedes reproduction. And so evolution by natural selection presupposes autopoiesis. And so there's some kind of a non-evolved organizational principle that has to be there before this wonderful process of natural selection can lead to any form of adaptation and speciation. And so when you make that kind of categorical distinction, division really between life and non-life, the origin of life seems to me to become totally intractable. It's just as hard as the hard problem of consciousness, really. And so when you say you think this is a matter of degrees, can you say a bit about how you imagine the origin of life? Do you have any favorite theories, or how do you approach that sort of a problem?
You want to start with an easy one?
I'm a philosopher, so whenever I get a scientist, I ask the hard questions, the basic questions, you know.
Well, I wonder if I might parry that a little bit with the idea that if only we could get to self-reproduction, natural selection would kick in and then everything else would follow. So I don't think that's right. I don't think, as I said, I don't think that it does as much explaining as it's purported to do, or people have faith in it doing. And that it's the idea that if only we could explain the origin of evolution, then the origin of everything else would be fine. I don't think that's quite the right way to look at it. And whilst I would agree that a system, it might be true that a system needs to be a self, it needs to be self-sustaining before it can be self-reproducing. I'm resisting slightly the implication that we have to explain self-sustaining because we have to explain self-reproduction, because if we did, that would explain everything else. I think that that way of framing the question, what's the thing that we're trying to explain? We're trying to explain why these particular things are the things that we see in the living world and not other things, right? Why are those things the things that are here? And when you frame it that way, it automatically becomes a question of explaining why did these things persist or proliferate when those things didn't? And the answer to that has to be because of their capacity to persist or their capacity to proliferate. And then it's as though the question has been defined as which are the things that survive and reproduce the best, as though that was the thing that needed explaining. But I'm interested to know how a process ontology expert sees the thing that needs explaining. Because for me, it feels more like the thing that needs explaining are processes of transformation, processes of change, rather than invariance, rather than things that persist. That the idea of, if only you could explain how this thing persists so well when other things didn't, that would have, that's, you know, now we're halfway there to explaining the complexity and diversity of life. And I don't feel like that's the case at all. I imagine that a process relational ontology perspective is less inclined to view the persistence of things as the thing that needs to be explained, the explanandum. Am I right?
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. You know, Whitehead has this, Alfred North Whitehead, 20th century process thinker, um, has this little book called The Function of Reason, and he's really focusing in on Darwin's theory of natural selection and there's a kind of tautological way in which it can be framed, where, the organisms that survive today are here today because they survived in the past. And um, from his point of view, what needs to be explained in evolution is why there should be this upward trend in complexity. Because if survival was the name of the game, he jokes, rocks are doing a far better job than any organism.
Yeah.
And in fact, this um, it's not that he's saying that evolution has a single arrow towards some particular form of complexity, but it does appear that we've gone from simple single cells to more complex single cells to multicellular uh, organisms and animals and whatnot. That there's an increase actually in the sensitivity and the fragility of organisms over the course of evolution. Survival power is not what's being increased.
Yeah.
So there's something else that needs to be explained besides just what natural selection can account for. And
Yeah.
anyways, Darwin never really pretended to do anything else than offer some mechanism that could explain speciation. And I guess with some of the discoveries in molecular biology in the 20th century, that was the the claim was inflated a bit to be this is an explanation for life uh, as such. Darwin was never claiming that. He I think
Yeah.
felt that there
Yeah.
was more going on than his natural selection theory could account for.
It didn't
Um,
explain speciation either, but that's another topic.
well, sure, it's part of the explanation, right? Um, and so, yeah, what needs to be explained is this trend toward complexity. It seems like uh, there are sources of agency at play here. Organisms are not passively selected by a fixed environment. From the get-go, organisms are engaged in the transformation of their environment. And so, yeah, that doesn't mean selection can't happen. Of course, selection is still happening, but the selection is coming from both directions at once. Um, and and so there's some, I think, hidden factor here, hidden to uh, reductive forms of materialistic science that's active in the living world, and maybe if life is a matter of degrees, maybe even in the physical world as such, that's driving this complexification process. And it doesn't need to be that there's one global telos and we're all being lured towards this omega point or something, as Teilhard de Chardin would argue. But there does seem to be aims, plural, at work, agencies at work. And when you begin to factor that into evolution, and maybe this is similar to what you mean by cognition, memory, learning, um, there are forms of inheritance that are far beyond just the genes, um, far beyond even anything epigenetic that's merely physical. There's a kind of, there's the Baldwin effect, but there's the inheritance of uh, what's been learned that gets passed on to each generation, and it will affect the genome eventually. But which direction are the causal arrows going here?
Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, that's kind of the picture as I see it. I don't know how that lands
Yes,
for you.
I completely agree. So it's considered to be anomalous and exceptional that we recognize that there are non-genetic mechanisms of inheritance, or that organisms can modify their own selective environment, or that organisms have mechanisms of adaptive phenotypic plasticity in addition to their genetic adaptation. And these things are treated as sort of add-ons to the core engine of natural selection, which is doing all the driving. But it becomes, you know, they're at, why are they at, and why aren't they central? Well, because the engine of natural selection is the thing that creates all the adaptation. And then if the niche construction is adaptive, or the phenotypic plasticity is adaptive, or the epigenetic inheritance is adaptive, it's only adaptive because natural selection made it so, right? Otherwise, it's just shit that happens, right? It's just, you know, physical things are in complicated contexts, and there's all sorts of feedbacks there, but they can't be contributing to adaptive complexity, because there isn't any way that anything can contribute to adaptive complexity in the natural world spontaneously, i.e. without design, unless it was done by natural selection. That's the real roadblock that is in the way that I see it. So to me, it seems obvious that natural selection isn't the only mechanism capable of producing adaptive organization, because systems that can learn acquire adaptive knowledge or adaptive organization that isn't put there by natural selection. When you learn something, the adaptive knowledge that you learn is not acquired through a selective process, and the credit for it being adaptive is not given, should not be given, to the genetic evolution. It might be, of course, the case that the learning machinery was created by the genetic evolution, but already that's enough to recognize that learning is a different process of acquiring adaptive organization that isn't the same as natural selection. There doesn't have to be a natural selection process going on in the head in order for you to acquire adaptive information. It's a transformational process. If we model it as a simple neural network, the changes in the weights are simply following a gradient. They don't need to do variation and selection in order to find good wirings. So then the question becomes not, are there any other processes of adaptation? Instead, the question could become, what kinds of systems can learn? And do all of the systems that can learn have to have machinery that was itself created by natural selection? Or can it be a primary source? Can it be a prime mover in adaptive stories? And I think that it can. I think that the criteria for a system to be able to learn, in a primitive sense at least, are not onerous, right? You start with a system that is able to hold state, a memory. That's trivial in physical systems. A bed of clay holds information about its past experience or interaction with the environment, but it only holds one memory, right? It gets overwritten by the next memory. And the thing that begins to move along the spectrum of possibilities that we would call cognition is that the internal state that's held from past experience can be held in a compressed representation that can then be brought back, right? So that it's not a one-to-one imprint like a print in clay is, but that it's a change to the internal organization of a dynamical system, which enables it to recall that pattern of shape and form, which was a consequence of its interaction with the environment in the past, but it's able to recall that pattern of shape and form in the future or in a different context. And that's not difficult to do with physical systems of particular properties either. So work which I've done with Chris Buckley at Sussex shows that you can do the same kind of associative learning that you can do in a simple artificial neural network like a Hopfield network. You can do that with just a system of particles connected by springs, if the springs are slightly plastic. Right? If the springs are perfectly elastic, then it can't actually remember anything because it just goes back to where it was before. But if the springs are slightly plastic, then it has a dynamical behavior, but the dynamical behavior is affected by its past states. And the changes in the natural lengths of the springs are mathematically isomorphic to the changes in the connection of weight strengths in a learning neural network. Not because it's engineered to do that, just because that's what happens when physical systems are pushed by their environment. They give way under that stress, and they give way in the direction that makes them accommodate to that stress. So it's not difficult to get physical systems to demonstrate memory. And if that memory is compressed, that the springs are representing the relationships between particles, not the unique positions of particles, then it's also a memory that can remember more than one thing, and a memory that can generalize so that it recalls other patterns from the same class instead of just the instances which have been seen in the past. So that's memory and learning. And the last step is, can you get from learning in the sense of being trained to remember a set of patterns, can you get from that to adaptive behavior, which is the ability of a system to find configurations that alleviate stress better than a local hill climber would. So when you push on a physical system, it gives way. If there are any constraints in the system, it gives way until it finds a locally optimal configuration, and then it's stuck. And it can't get to better configurations than that, better in the sense of alleviating the stress among its own components. But if it has, if it's subject to a set of disturbances over time, and it has some of that plasticity to it, like the springs that give way, then it's able to change its dynamical trajectories in such a way that it gets better at finding configurations that alleviate stress between its components over time. It learns how to find configurations which are less stressful, which is another way of saying that it learns about the pattern of perturbations, or it learns about the structure of its own environment. It becomes a model or a mirror of its environment, not just a print like the clay was, but a deeper model that knows about the dynamical causal relationships among variables in the environment that it's inducing into the internal variables of the system. And all of that can happen without there being any natural selection involved. So if you have a physical system with a boundary, a Markov blanket, as Friston would say, with internal degrees of freedom that can be deformed through their interaction with the environment, it will become a model of the environment. And you don't need any learning mechanisms that are evolved for doing that, or you don't need any natural selection involved in the process of it. You don't need any natural selection involved to make the system do that. That happens spontaneously. And I think that it's more fruitful to think of cognition of that kind occurring spontaneously as something which comes first in living systems, and the particular special machinery of doing self-reproduction that is involved in natural selection is something that's derived from that as a particular kind of way of storing information that has already been learned by the dynamics of the system, right? Genes are a way of storing information that's already been learned, rather than thinking of genetic information and the natural selection acting on it as the engine that created the cognition, right? To completely turn it around. Any of that makes sense?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So I want to lay out a particular scenario for the origin of life and see how you might translate it into these terms.
Yeah.
Because this particular approach, it's often called the hot spring hypothesis. David Deamer and Bruce Damer and colleagues have developed this, and it involves life originating on volcanic islands in fresh water, actually, where at the edges of these volcanic pools that would be regularly dehydrating and then rehydrated when a geyser goes off, say, there would be all the lipids you need and the organic chemistry and RNA and everything's there to create a situation where you get these spontaneously forming protocells that have packets of chemistry inside of them during the wet phase, and then as the pool dehydrates, you get this sort of gel-like phase where that chemistry can mix. And their idea is that in repeated cyclings of wet and dry cycling, the dehydration allows for longer and longer polymers to form. And you get a kind of testing, so that they do see this as a kind of selection process where those protocells that bud off when the pool refills with water, they bud off from the side with their own unique little collection of molecules inside. They're being tested in that wet environment for stability, basically. And this process just iterates over and over and over and over again. And those packets of chemistry that survive come back into that gel-like phase and kind of share their battle-tested wares with that kind of lipid network that would be forming there. And then the water fills up again and they bud off. And so obviously there is a kind of chemical selection going on here, but there might also be something like very basic forms of memory and learning going on. So it sounds like we can combine your account with what they're suggesting. And you also get the added benefit of a kind of chemical selection here. So these accounts seem compatible to me, but it seems like what you're suggesting is another missing piece that could make this scenario more plausible, or any scenario for the origin of life is going to be more plausible if memory and learning are happening before you have a self-producing living cell.
I mean, you can look at it this way, right? Yes, I agree that that's a completely compatible story. So if we take natural selection to be the engine that produces all adaptation, and we're, for the sake of argument, confident that after we've got natural selection, everything else just follows, then the origin of life becomes a problem of the origin of evolution, and certain non-trivial machinery is required for a system to be self-reproducing, right? That doesn't come out of thin air. Conversely, if we were to take a cognition first theory for life, where natural selection is doing the bidding of life, which is intrinsically cognitive, then we need machinery that we need to jumpstart that story. Where does the cognitive machinery come from, right? So if we were to compare the stories for plausibility, it becomes one of, well, what's more likely? That cognition occurs spontaneously or that self-reproduction occurs spontaneously? And if you have in mind, ironically enough, cognition like ours that requires brains and neurons and can do the kind of reasoning that we do, then the answer to that seems hands down, self-reproduction is more plausible to occur spontaneously than cognition. But if you have in mind a more, shall we say, basal notion of cognition, the sort of cognition that all living systems do, that wherever we look in the tree of life, we find abilities to do memory, learning, and adaptation, doesn't involve neurons and brains. If we think about it that way, and we think about things like, well, a basic kind of memory is just an ability to hold an internal state, and a basic kind of learning is just a way to hold internal state in a compressed way, and a basic kind of adaptation is just that compressed information modifies the way in which you interact with the environment in future. Now, it doesn't seem so ridiculous that cognition could come first. And, it's an empirical matter, ultimately, of course, whether it's more plausible, less plausible, or what the actual fact of the matter was about what kind of machinery is more likely to arise or arose first. But I'm pushing back against the assumption that self-reproduction is the sort of atomistic engine of all adaptation. We can go, I think cognition is more primitive than that.
So in autopoietic theory, the claim is made by people like Evan Thompson that there's a so-called mind-life continuity thesis that living organization is already cognitive down to the single cell. I don't think Evan would want to go beyond that and say that cognition is occurring outside of that context, because Varela and Maturana defined autopoiesis in terms of operational closure, and it sounds like the scenario you were describing earlier with just these balls and springs, basically there's nothing like operational closure there, in the sense that nor is there self-production, that the balls aren't making the springs aren't making the balls. They found themselves in this situation. And so on their definition of cognition, there's this operational closure whereby the environment can perturb this cell, but how that cell responds is going to be based on its own internal dynamics. And further, they would say that this kind of cognitive agency that's realized as a result of this closure is simultaneously giving rise to a horizon of concern, they would say, or a very basic form of subjectivity, basically. And that cognition, in this sense, presupposes a kind of concern for one's own continued existence. And there's a kind of precariousness that comes alongside this capacity to be a cognitive agent. But it seems like the way you're defining cognition, it does not presuppose agency even. It arises spontaneously, as you say, and there's no subjectivity there. Who cares about it? It's just, there's memory here, there's learning here, but it's nobody's memory, it's nobody's learning, it's just happening in the environment.
Yeah. I mean, all matter is dynamic, right? There's no real hard balls in space, right? The questions the kinds of systems we're thinking about here are ones where that dynamism becomes relevant to the scales that we're interested in. So usually in physical systems, the dynamic nature of the atoms and the subatomic particles just isn't relevant to anything that we're looking at, because it's all disorganized and it all cancels out by the time we get to the scale of rocks. And they just that's what we mean by an inert thing. But in living things, the different scales of organization, the different scales of dynamic process are connected in a way that's unusual in the physical world, right? So what makes them interesting, what makes them living, is that the dynamical processes at one level of organization are connected to dynamical processes at many other levels of organization. That's the property that makes a system able to hold on to information in a way which doesn't look like an imprint, right? If it holds on to information at the level that it was given, like I give you some information at this level of organization and you take a print of it at that level of organization, that's not a memory, that's just a print, right? That's not an agent, that's just something that was affected by its environment. But when the information at that level of organization is pushed down through many levels of organization, at this level of organization where it started, it looks as though it's gone. Like, where did it go? Oh, it just dissipated away. But if you can bring that information back from those other levels of organization back to this level, then it looks like something that's been recalled, and it looks like something which Well, how is I'm trying to work towards how is that connected to agency or a memory of something rather than just a physical thing that's happening. And a physical thing that's happening. Um, and I did have a connection there, and the connection was no, it's gone.
Memory is a fleeting thing.
Yeah.
Well, if it comes back to you, interrupt me.
Yeah.
But so from a process ontological point of view, as you're saying, yes, matter is dynamic, and actually, in Whitehead's scheme of thought, you wouldn't talk about matter anymore. You talk about creativity. And so if you ask, well, what is everything made of? It's made of creativity. It's made of creative process. And so an atom is not a little BB, but a kind of vibratory streaming of energy. And there's a certain pattern that reiterates. Every element has its own vibratory frequency. And I think it is fair to say that there's a kind of primitive memory at work already at that scale, allowing for the reiteration of a vibratory pattern, right? And so rather than thinking of memory, I think a genetic reductionist would probably say, well, when we talk about genes as a kind of memory, we're making an analogy from our unconscious experience of memory, and it's really just molecules moving around that happen to be in the right dynamic patterns and to produce the phenotype or what have you. But if memory is just basic to material organization at every scale, I think that leads us to the position that we both share, which is that living organization is a matter of degrees, and the harnessing of this memory capacity that's just part of how organization at any scale arises. In fact, organization becomes like the organization of even a hydrogen atom is itself a function of memory already. And so I'm very interested in these sorts of accounts of evolution as a continuous process. And of course, emergence plays a role where you get these kinds of leaps to higher order forms of complexity. But the basic functions, I don't think, could emerge. Memory being one of them, consciousness being another. I think most process philosophies are also panpsychist in orientation, and there are different. There are some panpsychisms that are not process relational, so it's important to keep that in mind. The popular forms of panpsychism and analytic philosophy are not process oriented generally; they're substance oriented. So that's what you get this notion of consciousness being the intrinsic nature of an electron or something. That would not be a process way of speaking about it. Because the idea of an intrinsic nature, you could say, oh, well, physics understands the relational properties of photons and electrons, and the intrinsic nature of those particles is consciousness. And so you say, a photon has consciousness. From the process point of view, that doesn't make any sense because it implies a substance with properties. And process relational thought is an alternative rendering of that, where experience, the kind of experience that goes all the way down, is precisely more about this memory function. And so in the inorganic physical world, the predominant form of experience is memory. There's a kind of conformal feeling would be Whitehead's term for it, where the past is reiterated generally. And there is a little bit of learning because the universe didn't just stay plasma, didn't just stay hydrogen atoms. It learned how to do other stuff. And so gradually that capacity for memory becomes a capacity for learning. And as you were explaining, adaptive behavior, where the experience, it's like the duration of a moment of experience and its capacity to not only remember what came before, but to anticipate alternatives in the future, it begins to dilate,
Mm-hmm.
as evolution advances. And um, the the system which is doing the remembering becomes more complex.
Mm.
And so you end up with a continuous arc of evolution in that case. And um, I know I mentioned consciousness earlier, and maybe you don't have anything particularly helpful to say about it, but I think it seems to me that cognition already kind of implies that there's some kind of a experiential dimension to this.
Well,
It's yeah. What do you
yeah,
think
I
about
mean,
that?
I wonder, right? I mean, I feel like I can go quite a long way without invoking questions of an experiential nature. I mean, I can talk about what kind of problem solving can my little particles connected by springs do, and I don't need to talk about what experience they're having of it. But I'm, I've come to a position where I'm not afraid of words like cognition, and I'm not afraid of words like agency. Um, I'm mostly just not ready for consciousness yet. But because I've gone through a process of um, recognizing how easy it is to be blind to the aspects of living things that are actually important, like to ignore the fact that living things are agential, for example, to think of agency as like a non-thing, that survival and reproduction, they're proper things. Agency, we don't need to talk about that. It's not really relevant. It's like, how can agency not be relevant when you were trying to explain living things and how they arose, right? So having gone through that process, I have to concede that, it may be as ridiculous to say, well, yes, I'm interested in living things and their agency, but for now, I'm just going to ignore the fact that I'm conscious and that you are too. And as though that's not part of the question. I'm not looking at it. It's like stick it la la la, right? It's just don't know what to do with it. So that plays on my mind a little bit, ironically, that I know that there's something there that I'm ignoring. That there's a that's an issue that ought to be on the table that I don't want to put on the table.
Well, you can't do everything. Uh, and as a philosopher, I ask questions like, how is natural science possible? In other words, how did there come to be organisms capable of reflecting on the nature of the universe?
Mm-hmm.
That obviously presupposes that we're conscious agents. And so that there is science at all presupposes that there are conscious, intelligent agents who are asking these questions and doing this research and designing the experiments. And it strikes me as odd that for the better part of the last several centuries that we've really been perfecting this method, that the dominant account of the universe has been more or less mechanistic and basically has described a universe wherein intelligent agents capable of doing science should not exist. We should not be here. And so agency is something that we all know and love, and we feel that the idea of effort is at the very core of our everyday lives. Get up out of bed and decide what to do with myself. And I know there are plenty of people, Sapolsky, for example, who's written a popular book now, that we're all determined and that's all an illusion. And I think that's a completely self-undermining performative self-contradiction, those types of
Yeah.
arguments. But when we're trying to understand life, we're not just trying to understand some kind of like neutral objects out there that we somehow exist independently of. We're trying to understand ourselves ultimately, and we know ourselves from the inside out. And so something like a panpsychist, or Whitehead's usually called a pan-experientialist because he's not actually saying psyche or soul, or certainly self-reflexive consciousness or something goes all the way down. It's much more, let's call it basal experience. I mean, there are different arguments one could make for that, but the basic idea is that, we have one example of the inside of a physical system, namely ourselves. And I think to be civilized, ethical, moral beings, we have to assume that the agency we feel is effectual. It actually makes a difference in the world. And indeed, evolutionarily speaking, if this experiential aspect had no effect, it couldn't ever be selected for. And so if it isn't if it isn't connected somehow to the behavior of organisms, then it's even more mysterious. It's just purely an epiphenomenal ghost, and it becomes even more difficult to explain, I think.
Yeah.
But I think the idea here would be, the reason I would bring experience into this and suggest that it might go all the way down is because otherwise we can't account for ourselves as the ones who are asking these questions. And in so many cases in physics over the last century, we've had to bring the observer into the equation, so to speak. And I think that's increasingly, it needs to be the case in biology as well. That our first person experience is relevant to the sorts of questions we're asking about the nature of evolution. And I know that you have to choose your terms carefully as a scientist when you do this research, and that there are certain big picture questions that are not even tractable to actually, write journal articles about or do experiments about, because they're just too big. You need to specialize and zero in on tractable questions that can be answered in a lifetime. Whereas I have the luxury as a philosopher of not caring about what's if the question is answerable or not. I live for the questions, but so that's my big. What was that?
An interesting question is good enough.
Exactly. But I love to be in dialogue with scientists doing this type of research and expanding the questions that can be asked within the disciplines that they work within.
Yeah. I remembered the thing that I was going to say earlier, and I think it's still relevant. So if you think about this kind of system that I'm describing as having a dynamics that is holding a history of its past experience and recreating it, it's sort of absorbing it and then pushing it back out again. There's obviously a sort of a temporal dynamic to that too. It's not just an informational pattern, but a temporal dynamic of contraction and expansion of the pattern. And it's only going to be meaningful to the extent that something is happening in the environment that's on a similar timescale, so that it can resonate with it. So that there's a pattern of activity that's happening in the environment that induces an internal structure or organization within the system that we're interested in that reproduces that temporal pattern of activity. And if there's something, so that creates a system which has a structure which is caused by its interaction with the environment, but also acts back on the environment some point later in time. But if the activity in the environment is cyclic, if it's periodic, then that can become entrained in such a way that the response from the system appears to anticipate what's happening in the environment instead of coming behind what happens in the environment. In other words, anticipation is just being the right amount of late, right? Like if you're responding to something which is happening in the environment, response suggests that you're the effect, not the cause, that it's something that's happening afterwards, not before. But if the thing that's happening in the environment is cyclic and you have just the right amount of delay, then it will appear as though, do I really mean appear as though, or it really is, don't know, as though the actions are being caused by things which haven't happened yet, instead of being caused by things which have happened in the past. And I think that's what we recognize as agency, is that actions are being taken on the basis of the consequence of things which are going to happen, in other words, anticipating, instead of non-agential artifacts which appear like they're just being pushed around by their environment. They're just affected by it rather than acting on future consequences. So the future consequences become the things which cause the actions instead of the past causes. So that relates to the notion of, how do you get from something which is how do you start moving on that spectrum from something which is sort of purely physical, in inverted commas, to something which appears to be agential, is that the time frame of how much into the future can you appear to be anticipating depends on the depth of the cognitive depth of the ability to hold that information from the past. So your ability to recognize temporal patterns over long timescales gives you an ability to anticipate future temporal patterns moving forwards. And that's what makes things look less inert, less like rocks, and more like agents. That I also noticed that ability of a system to engage, anticipate, remember, recall, act agentially is obviously relational, right? That it's in one environment, it would just look like a rock. In another environment, it could look agential, because it would depend on the kind of pattern that it can learn and the kind of time scale that it operates on. And that's really about sort of resonance between the system and the environment. That if you were to interrogate an agential system with rocks, it would not look agential. And if you were to, vice versa, right? That it's really about the system and the environment mirroring each other. And the reason I was saying that was because that suggests to me that a system is only able to see in its environment stuff which is fundamentally like itself, only really able to resonate with things that I have good inductive bias for. I only have good inductive bias for it because we're built out of the same kind of stuff. And anything which is happening on a frequency which I can't resonate to, I just can't see it. It's just not there. In the physical analog of one pendulum phase locking with another, if they're different frequencies, they just don't see each other, right? They just don't phase lock. They don't have any influence on each other. To be more exact, the influence that they have one way is exactly counteracted by the influence that has another way, so that there's no buildup of the influence is what's really going on. So I think that says something about our ability to see agency in other things, is because those other things have agency like ours, because they are systems which have the same kind of cognitive depth as us. But whereas we might find it difficult to see cognitive agency in the planet as a whole because it doesn't have the right temporal scales or the right patterns of salience for it to resonate with us, right? And likewise, I don't know about you, but I don't resonate that deeply with individual atoms, right? I can't relate to the agency that they have, but I don't know how they feel about each other, right? About the, you know, the kind of resonance that they do with each other is quite profound, at least in so much as they participate in making biological organisms sometimes, right? So in those circumstances, they do communicate with one another in a way that creates organization at multiple scales. And I think that does say something. I'm trying to get back to, does that say something about what it means to be experiential? And does it say something about how is natural science possible at all? And so I'm somewhat skeptical that, in fact, I'm very skeptical that we see the universe as it is. I think we do make theories about the universe and those do seem to work. But I think that that's because the only things we can see about the universe are the things which resonate with us. We're only seeing the things which all of the things we see are by necessity the kinds of things which have something in common and therefore fit together or are amenable to theory because they're all things that were perceived by us. That's what they have in common, and that's why they're amenable to theory. And all of the stuff which doesn't make sense, we just act like we can't even see it. That's just random. That's just stochastic. That's just a universal law. That doesn't have anything amenable to science in it. And we just ignore it, just blank it. That doesn't speak to an experiential aspect, though. But does any of that resonate with you?
Well, yes, I think a lot about hypothetically, if we were to encounter an intelligent alien species, would their physics be radically different? Their theories of physics be radically different from ours? And I suspect yes. But I would also suspect that there would be some way to translate between the two approaches, the two perspectives.
Well, if we can see these aliens at all, then yes.
Sure, right. But we share a deep history in the sense that we're part of the same universe.
Yeah.
Right. But I very much appreciate the account you're offering of this process of sort of the internalization of environmental rhythms and how that can lead to a kind of anticipation. And it connects, I think, quite directly to the question, how is science possible? Plato, I think it's in the Laws, it's one of his late dialogues, he talks about how the periodic movements of the stars and the planets actually is what taught human beings math. Right? By internalizing the regular periodic cycles, the seasonal rhythm, the lunar cycle, tracking planetary orbits, which were a little bit more difficult because of this retrograde thing, which was a huge problem for Plato. He's like, that can't be right. So there's something else going on here that would explain that apparently chaotic wandering motion, right? But that's a human scale example.
Sorry, I lost you a little
bit
there, Matt. You froze for a bit. I don't know if that's what you saw, Justin.
Am I back?
Yeah, you're back live. You stuttered for a moment. You didn't stutter, your frame stuttered.
Okay. It's just it seems to me that what Plato is suggesting here, that the stars, the periodic movements of the heavens taught human beings math, is a human scale example of a principle that can be generalized, as you were describing earlier, of this learning and adaptive behavior coming from anticipation is a function of the internalization of environmental rhythms. And it actually links up beautifully with this origin of life scenario I presented earlier, which is also very much about the rhythm of this wet-dry cycling. And so, Whitehead says life is rhythm. and it's about the building up of cycles within cycles within cycles. And it would seem like you can get an account of what you're calling anticipation without there needing to be any experiential aspect here. That it's just about the internalized anticipation is just the internalized cycle, and it appears like there's a kind of subject in there it's like, oh, I know what's going to come next, so I'll do this, when really it's just a slightly off, the timing of the cycle internal to the organism is slightly off the larger cycle that it internalized, and so it seems like the cause and effect gets reversed.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, if we understand experience as in terms of like whenever there's a kind of vibratory resonance, there is there's an aesthetic dimension to it, a kind of aesthetic contrast, which is present. And Whitehead would say there's no such thing as nature at an instant. The idea of a point instant is a complete abstraction. Nature is made of events, and an event or an occasion is a duration. There's a tension which is emerging between the just prior moment and the next moment, and it's in that tension between past and future that some kind of aesthetic contrast is born, is established.
Yeah. I think it's
right?
easier to get to valence or affect than it is to get to experience. I mean, so if I'm a system with many levels of resonating rhythmic activity internally, which is capable of holding information from the deep past that affects my future behavior, and something happens in the environment which causes a sort of a deep feeling of recognition, right? Something which resonates deeply at many frequencies and many levels of organization. And in particular, something which, shall we say, takes the grit out of my wheels. It adds a note to the song that I'm singing that makes the notes that I'm already singing more harmonious, not less harmonious. That seems like something I would like. Whereas if I receive something from the environment with a sharp corner, something that resonates with some parts but not with others, or causes the gears to crunch, that's going to be something that I don't like. I'm just speaking intuitively. I don't really know how to connect that up in any deep philosophical way.
Well, just when we talk about dissonance and consonance, or dissonance and harmonization, we're using aesthetic categories. But when we see vibratory cycling processes in nature, we're seeing from the outside something we can measure in terms of frequency or whatever. But what is it from the inside? What is it like to be that? And why is it that nature seems to why is it that we seem to prefer harmonization over dissonance? I mean, and sometimes dissonance can be interesting, but only because it's part of a larger harmony that can be reestablished. And so there's an aesthetic dimension that you don't have to add for the math to work, so that we can, or to precisely measure these, processes of vibratory reiteration or what have you. But we know from our own experience from the inside out that certain vibratory patterns are pleasing and others are not. And so there's a adversion, aversion type of polarity that arises. And maybe, William Blake was right about energy being eternal delight, and that part of what's driving this evolutionary process at every scale is this desire, which maybe initially was a kind of unconscious desire, but gradually becoming more conscious, a desire for more interesting music, and that maybe that sounds too cute and pretty, but I think when we step back and take in the whole cosmic drama and our human situation, I really feel like we need better stories that are compatible with the science, but that also allow us to connect our understanding of nature to our human lives, because there's a certain form of science right now that drains life of meaning. And I wouldn't even say it's a certain form of science. It's the way that science can be popularized sometimes as this heroic story of, we don't need any meaning anymore because we're just, going to pull ourselves up by our bootstraps and get on with it.
Reductionist science takes every aspect of our observations and experience where we might have looked for meaning, and takes them apart and then declares nothing to see here.
Yeah. And so, I'm not embarrassed to say I'm a bit of a romantic here. And I think, as you're suggesting, the reductive method murders to dissect. And there's a way in which I think contemporary sciences of complexity and systems theory, and that we've moved beyond that in the way that practicing scientists are engaging, but we haven't. And there are more people telling these stories and offering narratives, but there still seems to be this very strong desire among some scientists to attempt what Whitehead refers to as heroic feats of explaining away. And it seems to me that we can start with the simple, reduce things down to the simple components, and see how we could then add back up to the more complex. But there are also explanatory strategies that work in the reverse direction. Namely, like I asked earlier, how is natural science even possible in the first place? Let's start with this seemingly very complex animal species, look at our capacities, and then maybe we can understand ourselves as an exemplification of what the universe is doing, rather than a random, highly improbable exception to what the universe is doing.
Yes.
Right. And then a whole different kind of science becomes possible, where the human being almost becomes a lens through which we can look to understand the world, instead of being really obsessed with avoiding anthropomorphism and anthropocentrism, which, we want to be careful about that. But at the same time, we're here. The universe did give rise to human beings, to complex life. And that should tell us something about the nature of the universe.
Right? Yes, you don't want to do unnecessary anthropomorphism, but you also don't want to do unnecessary exceptionalism.
Yeah.
We just stay outside of the system and we're nothing to do with it.
Right.
It's of deep concern to me the way that reductionist science, and evolutionary theory in particular, removes meaning, such that, we don't have any agency in our lives, because agency isn't a thing anyway. And even if it was, it would be an adaptation of natural selection, which is to say, it's just another trait that our genes make us do in order to service their survival and reproductive imperatives. Curiously, genes are allowed to have agency in that story, but nothing else is, which is very weird. And if we want a sort of, that's our scientific origin story, where we came from evolutionarily. And if we are imagining, if our scientific origin story says none of this has any meaning, you don't have any meaning, there is no such thing as your own agency, you are not part of this story, you're just a product of this story, and that robs living things, not only robs living things of their agency, but it robs us of any meaning in that account, in that narrative. science needs to tell better stories. It needs to tell stories that allow us to have meaning. And to do that, it needs an origin story that doesn't eradicate, not just, oh, it turns out that there wasn't any, but that it was set up in such a way that there couldn't be any. Right? The reductionist method couldn't possibly find any meaning. I'm not above identifying myself as a romantic either.
Yeah. Well, it seems to me that there is, there was a moment, maybe right around the turn from the 18th to the 19th century, when, electricity and magnetism were being discovered, and the age of the Earth was being discovered, and Romanticism was being, born in Germany and England. And there was a moment when a different kind of science, maybe a more organic kind of science, was possible. But then in the 19th century, mechanistic materialism won out, because I think it had more immediate industrial application and so economic payoff. But there's a whole approach. It's philosophical, and there's a epistemological and even a methodology that's there, that had been worked out in great detail and with tremendous rigor by people like Goethe, actually, and Schelling, um, and it's a view of evolution as purposeful, and of the human being as, again, a natural expression of what the universe has been doing from the beginning. And I think, 200 years of mechanistic science have not just led us to some theoretical dead ends. They've had this view of the universe has had rather destructive practical consequences, both for human meaning and, for life on the planet more broadly. We've treated, the living systems of the planet like machines, and the result is mass extinction and climate chaos and all the rest of it. And so there's a real, I think, recognition of the need for a different way. And it's not that I think we should go back to 1800, but I think the sciences of complexity and complex systems were actually there, in the work of philosophers like Schelling, who's, I'm a big fan of Schelling, early process philosopher, and that we can recover a lot of at least the philosophical underpinnings of a new kind of science. It's there, right? And it needs to be applied, and we need to ask different questions and do different kinds of experiments to kind of legitimize it. But nonetheless, it's there, and it gives us a different picture of the natural world as not devoid of all of the qualitative things that, poets want to sing about, but that, as Whitehead would say, Whitehead redefines nature, and he's inheriting this romantic tradition. He has a whole chapter in Science in the Modern World called The Romantic Reaction. And he criticizes some of the romantics for being a little bit too quick to reject science. Whitehead wants to reform science. But he says, look, nature is what we are aware of in perception, which includes as much the red hue of the sunset as it does the electromagnetic radiation by which the physicist would want to explain that color. And when you reframe that and you allow us to overcome Galileo's separation between primary and secondary characteristics, a new kind of science becomes possible, that it's like putting the human being back into nature and not still having this, the Cartesian idea that scientists as observers are outside the world looking in at it, is a kind of residue of deism, really, right? And so if we can put the human being, put the scientist back into nature, and recognize that the colors that you see, the scents that you smell, the harmonies that you hear, these are all real facts in nature that are happening, right? And if our theories can't account for them, then we need better theories, and a new approach to theorization itself, perhaps.
Yeah. We can't be surprised the catastrophic meta crisis that we've created in the world if we tell people that life doesn't have any meaning beyond save for maximizing your survival and reproduction, right? If self-interest is the prime mover in all of life, why wouldn't you treat other people and the natural world as resources to be exploited?
I don't dismiss all evolutionary psychology, but don't get me started on the sorts of stories that are just so stories that are told that seem to me to be just thinly veiled justifications for current political economy, like the current political.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. What do you think, Justin?
Other than very much enjoying the conversation, I find you referenced Thompson's deep continuity earlier, and I find there's a nice continuity from my last conversation that was just uploaded 5 days ago with John Vervaeke. And Vervaeke's name came up with relevance realization earlier, and I posed this question to him. So synchrony there about the way I framed the question rather was that I wanted to ask him as both a Neoplatonist and Coxeye guy that's very much interested in cognition, and about that, what I would call the singularity of, and I'll use crude terms, abiogenesis, or I like what you and Tim Jackson call sympoiesis, which is derived from other philosophers, but that moment where, like you said, Matt, in those pools of warm water with the lipids and the RNAs and other things converging and cohering. So we had a good conversation about that, and I won't belabor it because I know you're coming up on an hour and a half, Matt. So, but anyway, I just would really appreciate that this conversation arose and we were able to talk about that. And John had some interesting insights, and we were able to talk about that for a little bit. And if we have enough time, what I thought was interesting from listening to both of you and knowing a little bit about your systems, that in process relational metaphysics a la Whitehead, that there are the eternal objects. And so, Richard, with your work, I'm thinking about scale invariance and cognition as also dimensionality, and not quite supervenience, but the influence, as you do in your lecture series. You talk about, you have wires that illustrate shadows and projections out from various geometric shapes that can have that inductive influence. So maybe this is another conversation, and maybe I'm just doing a cheap segue as a host to say, maybe we could continue if both of you are game, but maybe a couple minutes on that and then we can wrap it up. But yeah, Matt, I was thinking about Whitehead's eternal objects, and again that induction that comes down that Richard speaks to. So if either one of you wants to pick that up.
Eternal objects in 5 minutes. So
we can do another chapter if you guys want.
Well, I'll just say briefly that people come to Whitehead's process philosophy expecting everything to be flux and change, and they discover that he has one of his 2 major categories is eternal objects, and a lot of people are kind of put off by that. Like, what the hell do you mean there are these Platonic forms? I thought he was a process philosopher. But his eternal objects are different than Plato's forms, deeply informed by that original idea. And it's important to note that, people will refer to Platonism and think of Plato as this kind of 2-world dualist, where you've got the perfect eternal forms up in heaven, and then everything we experience in the physical world is a pale imitation of that. And that is a view that's given voice in some of Plato's dialogues, but it's important to remember that all of the best refutations of Plato's ideas are also in Plato's dialogues, right? Anyways, eternal objects are one of the 2 main categories in Whitehead's metaphysics. The other is actual occasions, or actual occasions of experience. And eternal objects are Whitehead's attempt to make sense of the function of possibility or potentiality in contemporary science on this question. Terence Deacon has this idea of absential features. I don't know if you're familiar with that, Richard, from his book Incomplete Nature. It's you could think of this as related to the idea of constraints, and it's basically when you think about everything that's already been actualized in the history of the universe, there's some infinite set of alternative possibilities which could have occurred and which may yet occur in the future. And so for Whitehead to understand creative process fully, you need more than just actuality. You need more than just what's already been actualized. You also need to make reference to possibility. And, this comes in, it's both an attempt to account for our own experience, our capacity to anticipate, but it's also coming right out of quantum physics. Heisenberg tries to resurrect Aristotle's idea of potentia in order to account for, what the wave function is suggesting. The alternate. So having some concept of eternal objects or potentia or possibility allows us to avoid, say, the many worlds interpretation of quantum physics, where every single path is actualized. If you have a category like eternal objects, you can say, well, no, most of those paths are not actualized. They're held in reserve, they're held in potential. And the realm of potentiality is there to be drawn upon by actual occasions. Whitehead's not suggesting that eternal objects reach in and do anything. But as a mathematician, he couldn't explain even something as simple as two-ness without making reference to the eternal object of two. And that's a deep debate among mathematicians and philosophers about the status of mathematical entities and relations. But also just color, too. It doesn't need to be a mathematical eternal object. The color red, for us to be able to recognize the same shade of red today and tomorrow, there's something about that quality that seems like it participates in time when the conditions are right, but it's not simply produced by or emergent from the given relations in a particular moment. It's called upon when it's needed, right? And so, yeah, it's metaphysics is hard, and so it's hard to just throw in a definition of eternal objects at the end of this long and interesting conversation, but it would be a way of accounting for our experience of alternatives, of what Stuart Kauffman would call the adjacent possible, right? That's his version of Whitehead's realm of eternal objects. Yeah. So I don't know if that makes any sense, but I tried my best in a short amount of time.
Well, I think I don't know if I'm finding the connection that Justin was looking for or not, but something comes to mind for me. That when you think about a process of learning, it is necessary to identify an inductive bias, because otherwise, out of the space of all possible models that are compatible with the data, if you draw upon them uniformly, they don't make any prediction. Only when you have a specific model that's compatible with the data, that makes a prediction, but that's capable of making a prediction, but that wasn't specified by the data. That was the inductive bias. It's the aspect of the model that comes from something other than the data. And so what's the space of possibilities where you want to draw upon those models, right? Because if you draw from the wrong space, if you draw from the wrong inductive bias, then learning isn't possible. Learning with generalization, I mean. And that feels like it feels like you're letting something in by the back door, something mystical about, well, how did you get the right inductive bias then? How do you explain that? On the other hand, in practical terms, learning works, machine learning works. It isn't difficult to find inductive biases that work. Parsimony is damn good inductive bias that works in very broadly. So it doesn't seem, you know, it's doable. It's not magic. It works, but there's still something there which needs explaining. It's like, why does it work, right? Why is it possible to find inductive biases that make learning with generalization possible? And the way that I make sense of that is that the system doing the learning and the system that is being learned about already shared something in common. They were already built from the same kind of stuff. They were already from the same kind of universe. And that commonality is what made the learning possible. But that commonality is a I guess that sort of, it's like it's sort of, you just push the question down the road a little bit, but why did they have something in common, right? And that's, I feel like that whole, as soon as you've decided that you're going to divide the universe in half, partition the universe into, well, this is the system doing the learning and this is the system that it's learning about. As soon as you've made that, drawn that line, you've made that mirror, you've introduced some invariants that are sort of, that are always there wherever you draw the line. It's like whatever, however you want to make that partition, you've made a partition. And in so doing, you're back in the same space where there are things that are going to be that follow from that necessarily, without there being that aren't just particulars that need you to pick out particular observations in order to find them to be true. It's there by virtue of making that partition. And that's what makes induction possible. And that kind of division, symmetry, asymmetry is a sort of something that you can't get away from. I don't know if that's feels like it's reaching into similar territory or not.
Well, resonance facilitates recognition is kind of what I'm deriving from that. And maybe that ties into the probabilistic nature of the eternal forms, that they are that which, you know, facilitates understanding. So again, if you guys are game, we could come back, we could pin this, or we can move into the metaphor of song. I mean, we didn't really touch that either. So there's so much richness, so much terrain to be traversed. So if you guys are game, maybe we could look a few weeks from now, whenever your schedules are open, we could try that and continue, because this was a beautiful and rich conversation. Richard,
Yeah,
you
no,
said,
I agree.
oh, sorry, go ahead, Matt, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I agree. I enjoyed this. I was glad I got to pick your brain a little bit, Richard, and appreciate your
likewise. I learned a
willingness
lot
to answer
more.
my questions.
I didn't know what Whitehead had written about evolution, and I've only learned a little bit today, but it's very interesting to me. I'd like to know more.
Well, his little book, The Function of Reason, it is little, and it's not written like his major work, like Process and Reality. It's actually, well, they're both in English, but it's actually English. You can read it. So I would recommend that little book.
I wouldn't have guessed that was the book I needed to look in from the title, so thank you.
Right.
Yeah. Well, maybe I can lead an outro with a cautious romanticism. And Richard, you said something to me in our conversation that we had a couple months ago, and it resonates with me so well, that you know, love is making oneself, and I'm probably not saying it directly, but love is making oneself vulnerable to know another. And I really just expand that. The other could be a book that you read, or somebody's thoughts and ideas, not just any you know, personal relations. And you know, meaning is connection in a sense. And so in making oneself vulnerable to know another, to make that connection, is good medicine. So I want to just acknowledge that really resonated with me. And of course, Matt, your work I've been following you for about 5 years, and I've had you on several times, and I really admire your project and what you're doing. So the two of you, thank you guys so much. And I hope this, to the YouTube audience, I hope this has impact and resonance for you all as well, because I know it did for me. And I look forward to more if we can facilitate that, we can make it happen.
Thanks for getting us together, Justin.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm the salon host, and so invite you in and see what comes of it. So
It's a great service. Yeah, thanks, Justin. And
yeah.
really lovely to be in dialogue with you, Richard, and happy to do another round at some point soon.
Okay. And to the YouTube audience, I'm sorry, Richard, go ahead.
That would be great.
Okay. All right. And thank you to the YouTube audience. I appreciate your attendance, your participation, and your involvement in this. So I'll say goodbye to both of you after I stop record, and I know you all have to leave, but thank you all again so much.